The invitation. Jake sat at the edge of his backyard pool, his feet splashing lazily in the cool water. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the yard. It was a quiet evening, just the way he liked it. The only sound was the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hum of passing cars. Then something moved in the trees. Jake frowned. His house was on the outskirts of town, with nothing but woods behind it. He turned his head slightly, pretending not to notice, but his eyes scanned the area carefully. A shadow flickered between the trees. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, taller than any normal person, and it was watching him. "Hey," Jake called out, his voice calm but firm. "You lost." Silence. He waited. Then, slowly, the figure stepped forward. As the last light of the sun touched it, Jake's eyes widened. It wasn't human. It was a female. At least, she looked somewhat human in shape. She had smooth, shimmering blue skin, almost like liquid metal. Her hair was long and dark, flowing down her back like strands of silk. But her eyes were huge, almost twice the size of a human's, and they glowed faintly, like stars trapped in deep water. Jake had seen aliens before. Ever since humanity had made contact with other species, it wasn't uncommon to run into them in big cities. But this was different. The alien female tilted her head, studying him. Then she spoke. "What is that?" Her voice was smooth, almost musical, but there was an odd sharpness to her words, as if she wasn't used to speaking his language. Jake followed her gaze. She was pointing at the pool. "This?" He tapped the water with his hand, making small ripples. "It's a swimming pool. Water. You don't have pools where you're from." She took a step closer, eyes locked on the water. "We do not have this kind of water." Jake smirked. "What, you guys drink sand or something?" She didn't laugh. Instead, she crouched down at the edge of the pool, staring at her reflection. Her long fingers hovered just above the surface. The air around her felt different, charged. Jake felt a small shiver run down his spine. "You want to try it?" he asked. Her eyes snapped up to him. "Try?" "Yeah, get in. It's nice." For a moment, she just stared. Then, with a slow nod, she straightened and stepped forward. She wasn't wearing much, just some form of sleek black bodysuit that shimmered like her skin. But as she moved toward the water, Jake noticed something strange. Her steps became lighter. It was almost like she was floating just above the ground. Then she took the final step. The moment her foot touched the water, a strange pulse rippled through the pool. The water shifted, not like a normal splash, but like it was responding to her presence. Jake's heart skipped a beat. You okay?" The alien female froze. For a second, nothing happened. Then her eyes widened, and she gasped. A deep, shuddering gasp, as if she had been hit by a powerful surge of energy. Jake took a step back. "Hey, maid." But she wasn't listening. Her entire body shivered, and suddenly, the water around her started to glow. Not just glow, it moved. Tiny waves rose around her like little hands reaching up to embrace her. Jake had seen a lot of weird things in his life, but this was something else. The alien female let out a slow, breathy sigh, her arms spreading out as if she was absorbing the water's energy. Her skin shimmered brighter, her hair lifting slightly as if caught in an invisible current. "This," she whispered, her voice deeper now, almost echoing. "This is incredible." Jake swallowed. "Yeah, you sure you're okay? You're kinda glowing." She turned to him, and for the first time, there was something new in her expression. Something wild. Something hungry. Her lips curled into a slow smile. "I never knew my body could feel this way." Jake took another step back. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. The water around her rippled again, this time rising higher, swirling around her legs like living tendrils. The pool wasn't just reacting to her. She was controlling it. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a simple swim. And whatever he had just invited into his pool, it wasn't human. The change begins. Jake watched in stunned silence as the water around Lyra moved on its own, rippling and swirling in unnatural patterns. It was almost hypnotic, like watching ink spread through clear liquid. Except this wasn't some trick of the light. The water was responding to her. Lyra stood waist-deep in the pool, her hands slowly rising as if she could feel the energy flowing through her body. Her glowing blue skin shimmered even brighter now, reflecting the water like polished metal. She wasn't just enjoying the sensation. She was feeding off it. A cold shiver ran down Jake's spine. He had seen powerful alien species before, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just strength. This was something primordial, something that shouldn't exist in an ordinary backyard swimming pool. You? Jake cleared his throat. You good? Lyra tilted her head slightly, as if hearing his voice for the first time. Slowly, her gaze shifted to him. Her pupils had changed. Before, they had been large and dark, almost human-like. Now, they were thin slits, glowing faintly, like liquid silver. This water, she whispered. It is not like the waters of my home. Jake nodded carefully. Yeah, I figured. You sure you're okay? You're kinda, glowing. And the pool's doing that weird thing. Lyra blinked slowly, as if processing his words. Then, without warning, she moved. 1 second she was standing still. The next, she shot forward, closing the distance between them in a blur. Jake barely had time to react. He stumbled backward, arms flailing as he fell into the water. A cold rush engulfed him as he hit the pool floor. He scrambled up, coughing. Geez, warn a guy next time. Lyra was right in front of him now, standing eerily still, her face inches from his. Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that sent a deep unease crawling up his spine. You do not feel it? She asked, her voice almost reverent. The power, the energy. Jake swallowed. I feel wet. Lyra's gaze flickered with something. Amusement. Curiosity. Hunger. He couldn't tell. Water is just water, he said, carefully pushing back. It cools you down, helps you float, makes for a good cannonball. It's not supposed to, do this. Lyra reached out a hand, palm facing upward. Instantly, the water around her rose, lifting into a swirling orb above her fingers. Jake's breath caught in his throat. Okay, that's new. She watched the floating water, fascination lighting up her expression. Then, with a flick of her wrist, the orb spun, twisting into different shapes like liquid glass. It stretched, coiled, then finally collapsed back into the pool with a gentle splash. Jake ran a hand through his wet hair, trying to shake off the growing tension in his gut. All right, Lyra, real talk. What the hell is going on? Are you like some kind of waterbender? Because that was some next-level sci-fi sorcery right there. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She stared at her hands, flexing her fingers as if they were new to her. This water is pure, she said softly. Different from what I have known. It does not resist me. It accepts me. Jake frowned. What does that even mean? Lyra turned to face him fully, her expression shifting. Before, she had seemed calm, almost peaceful. But now there was excitement in her eyes. And something else. Something dangerous. I do not know, she admitted, her voice trembling. Not with fear, but with something deeper. But I can feel it, changing me. Jake didn't like the sound of that. A strong pulse rippled through the water. The pool shook, as if something alive had just exhaled beneath the surface. Lyra let out a shuddering breath, her body tensing. Her muscles rippled beneath her metallic skin, and for a brief second, her veins glowed, pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent light. Then she laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was low, resonant, almost vibrating, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. The sound made the hair on Jake's arms stand on end. "Okay, nope," he said quickly, wading backward. "Nope, nope, nope. I think we're done here. Maybe dry off, grab a towel, and—" Lyra lifted her arms. The entire pool rose with her. Water exploded into the air, twisting and spiraling like a living storm. Massive waves surged upward, reaching twice the height of Jake's house. Jake's stomach dropped. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." Lyra stood at the center of the chaos, eyes wide with exhilaration. She wasn't struggling. She wasn't drowning. She was thriving. "This is incredible," she breathed, her voice layered, inhuman. "I can feel everything. The pull of every molecule, the weight of every drop." Jake scrambled toward the pool ladder, heart pounding. "Yeah. Well, guess what? You're about to flood my whole damn neighborhood." Lyra didn't seem to hear him. Her arms stretched higher, and the water obeyed, towering like a tidal wave waiting to crash. Then, suddenly, her body twitched. The glow around her flickered. Her expression shifted. Pain flashed across her face for the briefest moment. Then the water collapsed. Jake barely had time to suck in a breath before a shockwave sent him flying backward. He hit the pool deck hard, coughing out water. The entire backyard was soaked, the pool sloshing violently. Trees had been knocked over. The wooden fence was half destroyed. Jake groaned, rolling onto his side. "Ow." Lyra stood in the middle of the pool, panting. Her skin was still glowing, but it flickered now like a light struggling to stay on. Her fingers curled and uncurled, her expression unreadable. She slowly turned her gaze toward Jake. Something had changed. Something had awakened. Jake's instincts screamed at him. He had invited an alien into his pool for a harmless swim. But whatever she was now, she wasn't the same anymore. A new power. Jake coughed, spitting out pool water as he dragged himself to his feet. His entire body ached from the impact. The backyard was a disaster. Broken fence, overturned chairs, and the pool water still moving unnaturally, even after settling back into place. But none of that mattered right now. His eyes locked onto Lyra. She stood waist-deep in the pool, her body glowing faintly, her chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths. The playful curiosity she had shown earlier was gone. In its place was something primal, something barely restrained. "Lyra," Jake said carefully, wiping water from his face. "What the hell was that?" She didn't answer immediately. Her fingers flexed, her eyes fixed on her hands as if seeing them for the first time. Her muscles tensed, her veins still pulsing with that eerie, bioluminescent light. Her voice was different now. Stronger, deeper, layered. "I did not know my body could do that." Jake took a cautious step back. "Yeah. Well, neither did my backyard." He gestured at the wreckage. "Look at this. You almost took down my whole neighborhood with that stunt." Lyra finally looked up at him, blinking slowly. Then she did something that sent a fresh wave of unease through Jake's gut. She smiled. "I felt it," she whispered. "The water, it became part of me." Jake clenched his jaw. "Yeah, no kidding." She lifted one hand, and immediately the water responded. A thin stream rose from the pool, swirling around her fingers like a living serpent. It coiled, shifted, then snapped into a thin, sharp shape, almost like a blade made of pure liquid. Lyra's smile widened. Jake took another step back. "Okay, look, maybe it's time to take a break. Dry off. I don't know. Grab a burger or something. Whatever's happening, we should." Lyra moved. One moment she was standing in the pool. The next, she lunged forward, faster than Jake could react. The water beneath her propelled her, sending her shooting across the pool like a missile. In a blink, she was inches from him, her glowing eyes locked onto his. Jake barely had time to throw up his hands before. Wham! A simple splash. That's all it was. A tiny flick of water from Lyra's fingertips. But it hit Jake like a freight train. He was lifted off the ground, thrown backward through the air, and slammed against the wooden deck with bone-rattling force. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs, and for a moment, all he could do was gasp. Pain shot through his ribs. His vision blurred. He groaned, rolling onto his side. Holy hell. That was not normal. Jake had been in fights before, bar brawls, roughhousing with friends, even a few serious scraps. But this was like getting hit by a shockwave. His dazed eyes focused on Lyra, who was now standing at the edge of the pool, looking down at her own hands in fascination. She hadn't even tried to hurt him. That was just a reflex. Her gaze lifted back to Jake. I did not mean to do that. Jake coughed. Could have fooled me. She stepped forward, but Jake immediately flinched. Whoa, stay right there. Lyra hesitated. Something flashed in her eyes, almost like concern. I would not harm you. Jake gave her a look. Yeah, tell that to my ribs. She tilted her head, watching him curiously. Then, as if testing something, she raised her hand again. Jake's heart jumped. Hey, put the magic water down. She didn't listen. Instead, she flicked her fingers, and the pool responded instantly. A massive column of water shot up, twisting like a tornado above her. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The sheer power behind it was unreal. The water didn't just move, it bent to her will. It obeyed her. Lyra, Jake's voice was quieter now. You need to stop. Whatever's happening, it's not safe. Her glowing eyes met his, and for a moment, she seemed conflicted. Then her body twitched. The glow intensified, flickering erratically. She clenched her jaw, her expression suddenly tight with strain. I do not want to stop, she admitted, but I do not know if I can. A pulse of energy surged outward, rippling through the air like an invisible shockwave. Jake felt it vibrate through his bones. Something was wrong. Lyra wasn't just playing with her new power, it was consuming her. The glow around her flared, and she let out a sudden, shuddering gasp. Her body jerked, her muscles tensing like she was fighting something inside herself. Jake's stomach twisted. She wasn't in control anymore. And if she lost herself completely, Jake had no idea what would happen. The water tornado above her swelled, growing larger, darker. The sky overhead seemed to shift, storm clouds rolling in unnaturally fast. Jake forced himself to stand, wincing at the pain in his ribs. His mind raced. He needed to snap her out of this. Fast. Lyra, he shouted, stepping forward despite every instinct telling him to run. Her head snapped up. And for the first time, Jake saw fear in her glowing eyes. I do not know how to stop it, she whispered. Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just some weird alien talent. This was something deeper, something that wasn't supposed to be unleashed. And if they didn't figure out how to control it soon, it wasn't just his backyard that would be destroyed. It might be the entire town. The uncontrollable surge. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he watched Lyra struggle against the power raging inside her. The air was thick now, almost electric, like the moment before a lightning strike. The pool water, once calm and inviting, churned violently, rising in jagged waves that defied gravity. Every molecule of liquid seemed to obey her presence, moving in unnatural, chaotic patterns. And Lyra, she was drowning in it. Her breathing was ragged, her glowing veins pulsating with erratic energy. Her hands trembled at her sides, fingers twitching as though an unseen force was trying to take control of her body. I cannot contain it, she gasped. Jake could see it now. She wasn't just using the water, she was linked to it. It wasn't just a power she could turn on and off. It was alive inside her, and it was growing. All right, listen to me, Jake said, stepping forward carefully. His instincts screamed for him to run, to get out of there before this got worse, but he ignored them. He could see it in her eyes. Lyra was terrified. She had no idea what was happening to her, no idea how to stop it. "You're not alone in this," Jake said firmly. "We're gonna figure this out, but you have to focus. You have to." Boom! A pulse of raw energy exploded from Lyra's body, sending a shockwave outward. Jake barely had time to react before he was lifted off his feet, thrown backward like a ragdoll. He hit the ground hard, skidding across the wet deck. Pain flared up his spine, but he forced himself to move, rolling onto his stomach. The entire backyard was changing. The grass was soaked, but not from normal flooding. The water was crawling, pulsing, moving like it had a mind of its own. The pool had expanded, no longer just a contained body of water, but something alive, something breathing. Jake's eyes darted to Lyra. She stood in the center of the storm she had created, floating, not swimming, not standing, floating. She wasn't even touching the water anymore. Her body hovered just above the surface, as if gravity had given up trying to hold her down. Her hair lifted around her like it was caught in an invisible current, her once playful expression twisted with conflict. She looked like a goddess, or a storm given form. Jake swallowed hard. This was bad. "Lyra!" he yelled, forcing himself to his feet. His legs shook beneath him, but he stood firm. "You gotta fight this." She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto him. And for a split second, Jake wasn't sure if she recognized him anymore. The glow in her eyes had deepened. Her pupils were almost gone, consumed by shimmering light. Then she spoke. Only it wasn't just her voice anymore. It was layered. Multiple voices speaking at once. "I do not want to stop," she said, "but I do not know if I can." A sharp chill ran down Jake's spine. She wasn't just changing. She was becoming something else. Jake's mind raced. He needed to break her out of this before it was too late. He glanced at the water, then at Lyra. If she was connected to it, if she was feeding off it, then maybe. His eyes locked onto the pool's drain system. It was a long shot. A crazy long shot. But at this point, it was all he had. Taking a deep breath, Jake dove forward, sprinting toward the pool's edge. Lyra reacted instantly. The water lashed out before he could even reach the controls. A thick tendril of liquid snapped toward him, wrapping around his waist like a vice. Jake choked as the water yanked him off his feet. "Lyra," he gasped, struggling against the grip. "You're losing control." She stared down at him, her expression strangely distant, like she was barely hearing his words. Jake fought against the water, his muscles straining as he reached toward the edge. Just a little closer. The tendril tightened. Jake gagged, his vision blurring as the pressure increased. He wasn't going to make it. Then, Lyra twitched. The tendril holding Jake faltered, loosening just slightly. For the briefest moment, her glowing eyes dimmed. She saw him. She recognized him. Jake took his chance. With everything he had left, he lunged forward, slamming his fist against the emergency drain release. The effect was instant. A massive whirlpool formed, the drain pulling at the water with incredible force. The tendrils around Jake disintegrated, collapsing as the pool was suddenly emptied at high speed. Lyra screamed. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't hers. It was something deeper, something ancient. The glow around her shattered like breaking glass. The violent storm of water collapsed, slamming back down into the pool with a deafening crash. Jake hit the ground, gasping for air. His entire body ached, but he forced himself up, eyes snapping to Lyra. She was on her knees at the bottom of the drained pool, shaking. Her body was still glowing, but it was fading. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she lifted her gaze to Jake. And for the first time since this started, she looked scared. What is happening to me?" she whispered, her voice back to normal now. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his soaked hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse. But we need to find out before it happens again. Because one thing was crystal clear now. This wasn't just about Lyra anymore. Something inside her had awakened, and if they didn't figure out what it was soon, it wasn't just the backyard that would be in danger. It was the entire world. The authorities arrive. Jake stood on shaky legs, breathing heavily as he stared down at Lyra. She was still kneeling at the bottom of the drained pool, her glowing skin flickering like a dying light bulb. The violent storm she had created was gone, but its destruction remained. The yard was a wreck. Fence shattered, furniture overturned, water pooling in every direction. And Lyra. She looked small now. Not the unstoppable force she had been moments ago. Not the glowing, godlike being that had nearly torn apart reality with a wave of her hand. Just lost. Jake swallowed hard. He should have been relieved that it was over, that she was back to normal. But something in his gut told him this wasn't over. And that feeling became fact when the distant sound of sirens split the night. Jake's heart dropped. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Lyra's head snapped up. She heard it too. The deep, rhythmic hum of military drones now accompanied the wailing sirens. A second later, the sky flashed red and blue as emergency vehicles pulled up just beyond the backyard. Jake turned toward the street, his mind racing. How the hell did they get here so fast? He had been so focused on Lyra, on stopping her, that he hadn't noticed the dozens of people gathered outside the fence. Neighbors, strangers, some had their phones out, recording. A sick feeling twisted in his gut. The whole world had just seen this. And now, the government wanted answers. Jake barely had time to process before a sharp voice rang out through a megaphone. Unidentify into Remain where you are. A high-pitched whine filled the air as an anti-grav patrol drone swooped into view, its sleek, metallic body hovering just over the wrecked backyard. Bright floodlights blinded Jake and Lyra, locking onto them like a targeting system. Jake instinctively raised his hands. Lyra, still on her knees, flinched, her muscles tensing. Jake glanced at her. Don't move. She looked at him, her silver eyes filled with something close to panic. But it wasn't fear of capture. It was fear of losing control again. Jake understood in an instant. The stress, the adrenaline, the unpredictable power inside her. If they pushed her too hard, she might snap again. The megaphone crackled. Step away from DHE entity. Lie flat on the ground. Non TUMPLINC YLB immunity with force. Jake cursed under his breath. His brain was screaming at him to follow orders, to get on the ground and let them handle this. But Lyra, she wasn't an enemy. She was confused, and if she felt threatened right now, things would get worse. Before he could speak, a squad of soldiers moved in from the side yard, weapons drawn. Their black tactical suits bore no insignia, no military branch, no government ID. Private sector, which meant no rules. Jake's jaw clenched. One soldier, a woman with a scar across her cheek, raised a sonic suppression rifle. Jake had seen those before. Designed to neutralize enhanced entities, if they fired that at Lyra in her current state. Jake didn't know what would happen, but he was willing to bet it wouldn't be pretty. Lyra stiffened as the soldier took aim. Jake reacted instantly. He stepped in front of her, shielding her with his own body. The soldiers hesitated. Hold your fire, one of them barked. The woman with the scar didn't lower her weapon. Step aside. Civilian, she ordered. Jake shook his head. She's not a threat. The woman's cold gaze flicked between him and Lyra. Tell that to the crater in your backyard. Jake held his ground. She didn't mean to do it. She's not in control of. Lyra made a small sound, a sharp, pained breath. Jake turned just in time to see her clutching her head, her fingers digging into her temples. Her veins glowed again. Jake's stomach twisted. No, not now. The soldiers saw it too. Their weapons whined, charging up. Lyra shook, her whole body trembling like she was fighting an invisible force. Jake knelt in front of her. "Hey, look at me." She squeezed her eyes shut. Jake's heart pounded. He could see it happening again. The power inside her surging forward, clawing for control. If she lost it here, with guns trained on her, with drones recording everything, they would never let her go. Jake did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed her shoulders and shook her. Hard. Lyra. Wakey oop. Her eyes snapped open. Silver. Glowing. Jake held her gaze, his grip firm. "You're in control." Nodded. "You." Her breathing was ragged. I do not know how," she whispered. Jake squeezed her arms. "Then trust me." Her glow flickered. The soldiers tensed. For a long moment, everything hung in the balance. Then, Lyra exhaled. The glow in her veins dimmed. The storm inside her settled. The woman with the scar watched carefully, then gave a subtle hand signal. The squad lowered their weapons. The tension didn't disappear. But the moment of catastrophe had passed. For now, Jake let out a slow breath, his heart hammering. Lyra's hands trembled in his grip. "Are they going to take me?" she asked softly. Jake didn't answer, because he didn't know. But as the soldiers surrounded them, and a transport vehicle pulled into the street, Jake knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The final confrontation. The tension in the air was thick, heavier than the lingering humidity of the storm Lyra had unleashed. The squad of soldiers, clad in unmarked black gear, moved in with precise discipline, their weapons still lowered but ready to fire in an instant. Jake didn't trust them. Not one bit. Lyra sat still beside him, her glowing skin fading back to normal, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and weariness. She was holding it together, barely. Jake could tell. Whatever had awakened inside her, it wasn't just a power. It was something else, something dangerous. And if these people were here to capture her, not help her, Jake knew how this was going to end. The woman with the scar, clearly in charge, stepped forward, her expression stone cold. "Your name," she said, looking directly at Lyra. It wasn't a question. It was a command. Lyra hesitated. Jake could feel her tension beside him. After everything that just happened, her instincts were screaming fight or flight. Jake had to buy time. He straightened up, putting himself between her and the soldiers. "Look, lady, we just had a bit of a situation here," he said, forcing a casual shrug. "But it's over now. No need to bring out the big guns." The woman didn't even blink. "Your name," she repeated, this time to him. Jake sighed. "Jake Carter." "And the entity?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Her name is Lyra. And she's not an entity. She's a person." The woman didn't react, didn't even acknowledge his correction. Her gaze flicked to Lyra again. "You are not registered in any known interspecies databases. What species are you?" Jake glanced at Lyra, watching her expression carefully. She was tense, not just from fear, from something deeper. He knew what she was thinking. She didn't trust them. Hell, neither did he. But Lyra wasn't human. She wasn't used to this world, to its rules, to its lies. She didn't know how to play this game. So Jake played it for her. "She's a visitor," he said smoothly. "Just passing through." The woman with the scar wasn't buying it. "You do not understand the gravity of this situation," she said. "Your visitor just created an unregistered energy anomaly that triggered every detection system on this continent. She is a security risk." Jake crossed his arms. She lost control. It's not like she did it on purpose. Intent does not matter. The damage is done. Jake's gut twisted. He'd been in enough tight spots to recognize what was happening here. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take Lyra. And that meant he had to act. Now. "You don't have to do this," Jake said, keeping his voice even. "Just let us go. She's not hurting anyone." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Step aside." Jake didn't move. Lyra tensed beside him, her fingers curling into fists. He saw the glow start to creep back into her veins, subtle, but growing. Oh, hell no. Jake had to keep this from escalating. "If you take her," he said, keeping his voice low and firm, "you don't know what'll happen. She barely kept herself under control last time. You really want to see what happens if she freaks out again." The woman didn't even flinch. "We can contain her." Jake's heart slammed in his chest. That was it. That was confirmation. They weren't just taking her. They were locking her away, experimenting on her, studying her. Jake couldn't let that happen. Before he could respond, Lyra suddenly spoke. "No." The air shifted. Everyone went dead still. Jake turned to her, instantly alarmed. Lyra was standing now, and her eyes were glowing again. Not erratic, not flickering. Controlled. Jake's stomach dropped. "Lyra," he said carefully, his voice low. "Take a deep breath." She didn't move. Her gaze was locked onto the woman in black. "You will not take me," Lyra said. Her voice was calm, too calm. "I will not be your prisoner." The tension snapped like a rubber band pulled too tight. The woman with the scar raised her hand. The soldiers' weapons whined to full power. "Stand down," the woman ordered. Lyra didn't. Jake barely had time to react before everything exploded into chaos. The ground shook as Lyra raised her arms, but not in attack. In defense. Water ripped from the soil, from the air itself, swirling into an impenetrable shield around her and Jake. The soldiers opened fire. But the shots never landed. The water absorbed them, not just blocking them, but devouring them, swallowing the energy and dispersing it harmlessly. Jake's breath caught. She wasn't just controlling water now. She was evolving. And the soldiers. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The woman with the scar snarled. "Switch to suppression rounds." Jake grabbed Lyra's arm. "Lyra, we have to run." But she was locked in. Not lost. Not panicking. Focused. Her gaze swept over the squad like she was analyzing them. Then, in a voice filled with something ancient, she said, "You should leave." The water surged, and for the first time, the soldiers took a step back. Even the woman with the scar hesitated, because she realized something. Lyra wasn't afraid anymore. She was in control now. And if they pushed her, she wouldn't just fight back. She would win. Jake saw it in their faces. The shift, the calculation. The soldiers weren't prepared for this, and they knew it. The woman's jaw clenched. Then, finally, she made a decision. She lowered her weapon. "Fall back," she ordered. The squad hesitated. Then, one by one, they retreated. The drones powered down. The soldiers disappeared. And just like that, they were alone. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Lyra swayed slightly, her energy dimming. She exhaled, slow and controlled, then turned to Jake. "They will return," she said quietly. Jake ran a hand through his wet hair. "Yeah," he muttered. "I figured." Lyra studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "You stood in front of me." Jake snorted. "Yeah, well, call it a bad habit." Her expression softened. "Thank you." Jake sighed, shaking his head. "We're not out of this yet." Lyra nodded. But Jake could see it now. She wasn't just a lost alien anymore. She was something more. And whatever was coming next, they'd face it together. The resolution. The night air was thick with tension, even though the soldiers had retreated. The flashing lights of their vehicles were gone. The hum of drones had disappeared into the sky. But the feeling of being watched still lingered. Jake stood beside Lyra, his breathing still unsteady, His heart was pounding from the confrontation, but more than that, he couldn't shake the realization that they had won. Somehow, against impossible odds, Lyra had forced them to back down. She hadn't attacked them, hadn't lost control. She had simply stood her ground, and it had been enough. Jake let out a long breath and turned to her. She was still standing tall, but now that the fight was over, he could see the strain settling into her body. Her glowing veins were dimming, but not completely gone. She was changing, evolving into something new, something that the people hunting her wouldn't be able to control. That thought terrified Jake more than anything. "You okay?" he asked. Lyra exhaled, her silver eyes scanning the destroyed backyard. "I do not know." Jake gave her a look. "That's an improvement over, I do not know if I can stop it, so I'll take it." Her lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. She took a step forward, then swayed slightly. Jake caught her before she could fall. "Whoa. Okay. Easy there." She leaned into him for just a second before pulling away. "I am tired." Jake frowned. "That's new." Lyra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I have never used my abilities like this before. It drains me, but it also—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It also feeds me." Jake blinked. "Wait, feeds you?" She nodded again, looking down at her hands. "Every time I control the water, I feel more connected, more aware. But it also takes from me, like a cycle that has not yet balanced itself." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So we still don't know if this is a good thing, or you're about to turn into a world-ending disaster thing." Lyra didn't argue. Jake stepped back, taking in the wreckage of his backyard. The fence was completely obliterated, water still pooled everywhere, and his pool ruined. His entire neighborhood was going to have questions. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm not getting my deposit back." Lyra tilted her head. "Deposit?" Jake waved a hand. "Forget it." The silence stretched between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy. Because they both knew. The moment of peace was temporary. The people who had come tonight, they weren't going to forget this. And they weren't going to let her go. Jake turned back to her. "We need a plan." Lyra studied him. "To hide?" Jake hesitated. That was the logical answer. Get out of town. Lay low. Hope the government had bigger things to deal with. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't work. Lyra wasn't just some rogue alien. She was something else now. Something they didn't understand. And people fear what they don't understand. "If we run, they'll keep chasing us," Jake admitted. "They'll never stop looking. And next time, they'll bring a lot more firepower." Lyra's gaze darkened. "Then what do you propose?" Jake didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he had no idea. But if there was one thing he knew for certain, they couldn't keep playing defense. "They want answers," he said slowly. "They want to know what you are, what you can do." Lyra nodded. "They see me as a weapon." Jake met her gaze. "So let's make sure they see you as a person instead." She stared at him, eyes unreadable. "You believe that will stop them?" Jake snorted. "Hell no, but it'll buy us time." Lyra tilted her head. "Time for what?" Jake exhaled. "To figure out what you really are." Because the truth was, even after everything that had happened tonight, they still didn't have answers. Where did her power come from? Why had she changed after entering the water? Was this the beginning of something even bigger? Jake had a bad feeling in his gut. This wasn't just about Lyra anymore. This was about something bigger than both of them. And he wasn't going to wait around for the government to decide what that meant. They had to find the answers themselves, before it was too late. Lyra considered his words, then slowly nodded. "Very well." Jake grinned. "That a yes?" Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "It is an agreement." Jake rolled his eyes. Yeah. Close enough." She exhaled, glancing up at the night sky. The stars were still there, twinkling like they hadn't just survived a near-apocalyptic event. "Where do we begin?" Lyra asked. Jake followed her gaze, thinking. Then, with a smirk, he looked back at her. "First," he gestured to the destroyed backyard, "we're gonna need a new place to crash." Lyra raised an eyebrow. "And after that?" Jake's grin faded into something more serious. "Then," he exhaled, "we find out what the hell is really going on with you." Because deep down, Jake knew this wasn't the end of the story. This was only the beginning. And whatever came next, they'd face it together, no matter what.